Okie dokie. Are you ready? Okay. Ready to start?
Yeah.
Well, thanks. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. First of all, great to see so many people have registered for this event this evening, hosted by the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. My name is Tony Burke. I am Assistant General Secretary of Unite and Chair of the campaign. And we have a number of speakers this evening, and I'm sure that you're going to find this meeting very constructive and helpful. I know that many of you will be aware of the revelations made recently in regard to the Venezuela reconstruction units in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And they are just on the long line of signals that the British government has been working to Trump's agenda for regime change in Venezuela. And that goes back to the UK hosting a meeting with Guaido, to the Bank of England's refusal to return the gold that it illegally holds from the Venezuelan government. And we can see that the UK is now becoming part of this role of the US's chief ally in pushing for intervention against a sovereign country and in breach of, as we've said on many occasions, international law. So we're here tonight to hear from excellent speakers on how far Britain has gone in promoting regime change in Venezuela and what we can do to build that opposition to what is an illegal intervention. And I'm going to hand over to the speakers in a second. We have 4 speakers: Susan Gray, Colin Burgon, John McEvoy, and Francisco Dominguez. And I'll take them in turn. Each of them will make a 6-minute presentation. We'll go through them and then we'll take questions. And as they come through, the secretary of the campaign, Matt, will forward them to me. So I want to kick off and say also that this is being broadcast on YouTube by the wonders of technology. So first of all, Sue, who is the vice chair of the campaign, it's over to you.
Muted. I'm just going to give some background about the US approach, US policy towards Venezuela. The US have supported the opposition in Venezuela ever since Chavez was elected in 1998. I'm just going to give you some examples of how they've done that. Starting off with political support. In 2002, there was an attempted coup in Venezuela. Chavez was briefly imprisoned and he was replaced by a businessman, Pedro Carmona, before being released by the military after popular protests. Now, according to officials at the OAS and various diplomatic sources, Carmona and other plotters had actually been making regular visits to the US to discuss the plans with the White House officials at the time for months before the coup took place. And interestingly, among President Bush's senior officials was Elliot Abrahams. Now, his notoriety actually dates back to the Reagan era in the 1980s, when he oversaw the policy of the covert policy of arming right-wing death squads in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And by the way, he is now Trump's special envoy for Venezuela. So at the time of that coup in 2002, the Bush administration not only knew about the coup beforehand, but they supported it. And on the day of the coup, his officials said that they would support a Carmona government. Now you fast forward to January 2019, and Juan Guaido, who was a minor politician in Venezuela, he had a phone call from Mike Pence, proclaimed himself president and was immediately recognized by the USA, and they still recognize him now, despite his evident failures and corruption. I'm sure we'll hear more about that later on. Another of the US tactics is funding of opposition activists. Over the decades, millions of dollars have been channeled into Venezuela to fund opposition groups. And a lot of this has been done through organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. This is one of Ronald Reagan's legacies. Every year, grants are awarded, often through NGOs, to projects that are designed to increase opposition activities and create hostile propaganda, and particularly through training of activists and students and other groups, and all under the guise of promoting democracy. And I've just got a few examples here. $75,000 to work with journalists to investigate corruption in the Venezuelan state. That's the goals of the project. Another one, $28,000 to train grassroots leaders in digital media. Another one, $50,000 to raise awareness of freedom of expression violations in Venezuela. These kind of projects are quite obviously hostile to the Venezuelan government, and they've been funded year after year after year. And the sums involved have skyrocketed recently, and most recently, the US has been directly funding Juan Guaido's project to set up a parallel government. The third example I give you is sanctions. People sometimes claim that the sanctions only started recently, or only started to affect the economy recently, but actually the sanctions, or the threat of sanctions, have discouraged investment in Venezuela ever since President Obama issued his executive order in 2015. And a string of multinational companies pulled out within a couple of years. And then there are other problems, such as foreign banks refusing to handle Venezuela's payments for imports of insulins and vaccines. Pharmaceutical companies refuse to issue export licenses for medicines, making it impossible for Venezuela to import them. Citgo, the US-based Venezuelan oil company, is prohibited from sending its profits back to Venezuela. Now, this usually amounts to about $1 billion a year. And then there's the recent case that's already been mentioned of the Bank of England refusing to hand back to Venezuela over $1 billion of its own gold. The sanctions have had a devastating effect on the economy, and they've been going on for years, and they have got nothing to do with democracy or improving the conditions for Venezuelan people. They're all about regime change. And for decades, that has actually been the policy of the US in Latin America whenever it encounters a government that doesn't toe the neoliberal line. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sue. I think that sets the scene very, very well. And I think you make the excellent point there about the continuing failed attempts by opposition to Maduro. They've continued to fail and actually have gone nowhere. And I think a lot of that is down to the resilience of Maduro and his supporters. Our next speaker is our good friend Colin Burgon. Colin is the president of the Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, who are helping us promote this event today. And of course, Colin has been directly involved in the Venezuela Solidarity for many years. Certainly was one of the colleagues who inspired me to become involved. So I'm going to hand over for 6 minutes to Colin to take you through how he sees the situation. Colin? We got no sound, Matt.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Carry
then.
on. Thanks,
okay.
mate.
My
Start again, Colin.
6 minutes from now. Hello to everybody. First of all, going to cover two things: the armed attacks on Venezuela and the role of the British government in supporting America. The facts are quite simple. On the 3rd and 4th of May, we had 60 to 80 mercenaries make an incursion into Venezuelan territory on speedboats from Colombia. Now, luckily, Venezuela knew about this incursion, but we also know that the US and Colombia knew about it. And by their very silence, we can argue they aided and abetted a piece of international terrorism. Will they ever be called to book? Well, watch this space. In this incursion, it's thrown up several kind of interesting personalities who've been involved in it. Just look at two of them. The first one is a man called Jordan Goodrow, runs a Silvercorp, a kind of military consultancy in Florida. And for those who know Latin American history, I think he's best described really as a 21st century William Walker. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. And I think he is a man who's attracted by, is almost a soldier of fortune, attracted by the $15 million bounty put upon Maduro's head. And he must have seen a great chance for him here. Linked in through a Florida network is our good friend Juan Guaido, who basically, as all the leaks have come out about this intervention, it's become quite clear that he's at the very center of the web. Now, let's get it absolutely straight about Guaido. He involves himself with drug dealers, is involved in financial corruption, and now he has supported an armed intervention into his own country, Venezuela. By any stretch of the imagination, that is the conduct of a traitor. Now, we may look upon this, and the media has attempted to portray it really as some kind of a joke intervention. It's like a Dad's Army event or a Bay of Piglets, as some people on the left have said. I would exercise a bit of caution, and I'll tell you why. Because this fits in with the whole panoply of weapons that the US will use, both political, economic, and military, to create a tension and fear within Venezuela. So we shouldn't underrate what has just happened or underestimate it. And I add one more thing. Two US citizens, former soldiers, are now in a Venezuelan prison. And Pompeo has pledged to get them released by using any means necessary. And I think that's loaded with kind of doom for us if we're not careful. And there will be more to come from Trump. We all understand the US elections mean that Trump has got to win in Florida. And Venezuela and Cuba are red button issues for a section of voters in Florida. So expect Trump to really press that button as we head that way. Secondly, the role of the UK government. We're often told that we have a special relationship with the US. If we're honest, if we're brutal, if we're analytical, it is a lapdog relationship. And part of that kind of relationship resulted in Guaido meeting Raab in January of this year in recognition of the British government effectively freezing Venezuelan assets in London. And then, as the chair has just alluded to, the construction of something called the Venezuelan Reconstruction Unit deep inside the Foreign Office. Has the Foreign Office got a history? Yeah. For people my age and even older who may be watching this program, we remember Chile in 1973 when the Foreign Office desperately tried to put a positive spin on the Pinochet coup against Allende. Recently, we've had the government and the Foreign Office doing exactly the same in Bolivia, welcoming the overthrow of a democratically elected leader and saying it's time for a new start in Bolivia. In my own experience in Parliament, I tried to raise the issue of the Honduras coup, and it was like swimming through treacle. It was as if you were actually coming into contact with US agents trying to slow you down. Don't want to get too paranoid about this. And then just to sum up, let's hope those who are listening in the Labour Party, I've noticed that Lisa Nandy, our shadow foreign secretary, is making some trenchant statements on events all around the world. And now will cut my ear to listen to the equally trenchant and assertive comments she's going to make about supporting progressive governments in Latin America and opposing Trump's regime change. And just one final point, a human point. A man called Martin Gugino, you may see him, he's the older bloke, he's even older than me. He's the man who was knocked down by the Buffalo police force in upstate New York. He is a progressive. He supports Latin America progressive governments. I think it'd be a great idea if we sent a message of solidarity to him as he lies in hospital tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Really inspiring, and I totally agree that we should send that message, and hopefully Matt and Francisco can perhaps do that. Now, just to let colleagues who are on the comrades know who are on this Zoom and the YouTube, we've actually got a very good attendance, and it's quite wide ranging. We've got people from the UK, from London, Norwich, Belfast in Northern Ireland, Plymouth, Colchester, Huddersfield, Brighton, Glasgow, Birmingham, Dorset, and we've got people who've come in from the Netherlands, and of course we have got people who are tuned in from Venezuela. So that's absolutely fantastic, and welcome to one and all to this meeting. Now, the next speaker is our good friend John McEvoy. Now, John is an investigative journalist who has broke some excellent recent stories and has written regularly for Tribune magazine, for Brazil Wire, and for the website Canary and Albadorda, and many more. And John, we'd like to hear from you about how you see the situation, particularly in regard to this issue that Colin's raised as well, about the relationship, not just with Trump, but the relationship with our own government. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tony. Just to add on to what Colin and Susan briefly mentioned earlier, I'd like to speak about the article that I published earlier in May regarding the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit that we found in the Foreign Office via Freedom of Information requests sent to the UK government over the past 7 or 8 months. So what we found was two kind of major things regarding this. The first is the existence of this Venezuela Reconstruction Unit that had never been revealed by the Foreign Office, by the government, by John Saville, the former UK ambassador to Venezuela between 2014 and 2017. But not just that, we also found private discussions between members of the Venezuelan opposition, namely Vanessa Neumann, who is Juan Guaido's UK representative, who calls herself the Venezuelan ambassador to the UK, though she actually holds none of the ambassadorial or diplomatic duties that are required. And so in these private conversations between members of the Foreign Office and Vanessa Neumann, we can see discussions about the sustenance of British business in a hypothetical post-coup era in Venezuela. And now, as I'm sure many people will be aware who are listening today, Venezuela sits upon the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So you can only start to imagine what these British business interests might be in a post-coup scenario. So the British government has responded to these revelations in a couple of separate ways. One of them is to say that the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit is dedicated to a peaceful resolution to the political crisis in Venezuela, which is almost laughable because since January 2019, at the very least, the UK government has been deeply involved in diplomatic efforts to destabilise the Venezuelan government. Secondly, the Venezuelan government, I spoke with Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza around 2 weeks ago, and they told me that they'd never been told about the existence of this unit to reconstruct a sovereign nation. And thirdly, if you just look at British, as was briefly mentioned, the activities of the British Foreign Office globally, if we take Iraq, for example, discussions prior to the invasion of Iraq that entailed the reconstruction of Iraq were not for any kind of peaceful or democratic or attendance to the civilian population. They all involved the redistribution of its oil reserves. As a matter of fact, the UK and the US might have actually been guilty of war crimes because in their reconstruction plans for the post-invasion period of Iraq, there was absolutely no preparation made for the civilian population whatsoever, and this was revealed by WikiLeaks. So I want to just briefly go through some historical precedent to the UK's involvement in Venezuela. Now, as has been mentioned, in January 2019, the FCO froze over $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold. Now, the Venezuelan government recently requested that this was unfrozen, given to the UN so that they could find more funds to deal with the coronavirus crisis. This has been blocked. The Department for International Development has also given over £40 million worth of supposedly humanitarian assistance to Venezuela since 2019. But just to add to what Susan said earlier, the Department for International Development frequently works with USAID and various other regime change organisations within the US, and they are not revealing to whom this money is going. To go back even further, in 2008, the British government lobbied aggressively against Venezuela getting a seat on the UN Security Council on the behest of the United States. And then to go back even further, for the past 3 decades, the UK government has been consistently arming and assisting the Colombian military, which since the election of Hugo Chavez has consistently been an adversarial power to the Venezuelan government. Now, just to add another part that's only recently been revealed, John Saville, the former UK ambassador to Venezuela, in recent interviews with the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza, he consistently says that Saville was not a friendly diplomat with regards to the Venezuelan government. He was consistently communicating with Voluntad Popular, Juan Guaido's political party. Back in 2017, John Saville actually tweeted a picture of himself walking through the National Assembly with Juan Guaido. So you kind of get a picture of this. I mean, obviously the Venezuelan Reconstruction Unit is quite an explosive revelation, but this is a kind of a slow, relentless operation that's been supported by the British government. Just to very briefly talk about Vanessa Neumann, Juan Guaido's UK representative, to get an idea of her kind of political outlook, she names Madeleine Albright as one of her political childhood heroes. Now, Madeleine Albright was told PBS News in relation to 500,000 Iraqi children dying as a cause of US sanctions, that this was a price worth paying. So this is quite important with regards to Venezuela and the economic sanctions against Venezuela at the moment. CEPR found that sanctions against Venezuela have killed as many as 40,000 people between 2017 and 2018 alone. The former UK ambassador for human rights, Alfred Desires, said this could be as many as 100,000 people. Aside from that, she's quite closely linked to the CIA and members of the CIA. She co-directs a company named Asymmetrico with 2 former CIA operatives who have functioned out of Nicaragua and various other Latin American countries. So you kind of get the idea of the broad array of forces angling for regime change in Venezuela coming from Britain at the moment.
Thank you very much, John. That was very, very interesting and some really insightful information there, particularly in regard to the unit that's operating with inside, I suppose, the deep vaults of the Foreign Office. And I think that's very useful. And I do hope that that article that you published, if it's online at some point, if you could identify it, I'm sure people would want to read it, John. Final speaker for this evening, before we take questions, is our good friend and comrade Francisco Dominguez, who's the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign Secretary and is head of Latin American Studies at Middlesex University and an authority on what's going on in Venezuela and Latin America. So over to you, Francisco, to give your contribution, and then we'll take some questions from colleagues who are on YouTube and on this the Zoom call. Francisco, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and I'm grateful to the speakers and for their contribution, which have been extremely informative. This is what our movement needs. But also to the organizers, that put this together, this is absolutely the right time to raise exactly these kind of issues to make sure they are part of the political discussion in the country by all sorts of progressive forces, which we really need, and certainly Venezuela needs. Now, the issue the United States faces now, in the context of a severe economic decline, which is really marked, very steep, but also with the massive complications that the pandemic is creating in its own economy, 42 million people unemployed, plus the uprising of youth, workers, and Black people and Latinos in that country, which have challenged the role of the US oligarchy like never before. This is completely unprecedented. So from their point of view, time regarding the issue of Venezuela is running out very, very fast indeed. Now, you would not expect people like Donald Trump, John Bolton, even though he's not in the government anymore, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and so forth, to actually come to reason faced with those obstacles. Quite the opposite. It's very likely that they're going to go for something very dramatic. And there are two issues here which are very central to them. Trump desperately needs some foreign policy victory. So far, on foreign policy, his adventures have produced very little. In fact, he's been defeated most of the time. You name North Korea, Iran, and so on. And he's already running behind in the polls in compared to Joe Biden, who is not a very exciting candidate. Nevertheless, even with that candidate, with opposition, he's facing, a steep challenge for the elections between now and November. Although in the United States, as you know, given the system, the electoral system they have, it is possible to lose the popular vote and to still be the president of the United States, as it happened in 2016 with him. So what I'm saying is, they're so desperate that they might go for something very dramatic. They have done the following things already. Very dramatic means some sort of serious military action. I'm not trying to suggest that this is inevitable, but certainly there are many indications that they are preparing for it. Number one, they have deployed a fleet, which is about 50 war machines, warships, planes, warplanes, submarines, God knows what else, in the Caribbean in order to, as they say, to stop the contraband of cocaine from Venezuela into the United States. What is less known is the fact that Britain has sent a warship to collaborate with this blockade. France has sent another one, another war ship called the Dixmude, and the Netherlands have also one. And all the warships and all the ships in the world have to have a system which is called AIM, A-I-M, by which is a sort of GPS of ships, by which you can see exactly where they are. Those three, from information coming from Venezuela, have decided to disconnect this system. And they already publicly, the three governments announced that they're going to collaborate with this blockade. This blockade threatens not only Venezuela, threatens anybody who tries to engage in commerce, trade, and exchanges with Venezuela, and certainly is a very serious threat against Cuba. And from the point of view of the formal narrative, official narrative of the government of Trump, in order to deal with Venezuela, you have to deal with Cuba. That's their line. So therefore, the threat is very serious indeed, and Trump has been taking one after another action against Venezuela. The last one was 2 days ago when they instructed the Marriott Hotel Company to pull out from Cuba, and they have to obey. So you can see that they're continuing to ratchet up sanctions against Cuba and against Venezuela, which they see as sort of, I don't know, axis of evil or tyranny, troika of tyranny, as John Bolton called them. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there are still camps for the training of mercenaries in Colombia as we speak. They have been trained under the supervision of Colombian military forces and US military forces. And the Colombian government, the Venezuelan government, has denounced that the Colombian government is the president himself is personally supervising and giving the go-ahead to this. And if there is going to be any war or any invasion against Venezuela, Colombia is central to it. And the reason is Colombia has 10 military bases as a result of the Defense Cooperation Agreement between Álvaro Uribe and George W. Bush back in 2009. So you can imagine the number of troops out there. And then recently, the United States, the embassy in Colombia, not the Ministry of Defense of Colombia, but the embassy of the US in Colombia, announced that they were deploying special elite forces, 800 of them, to come to Colombia to advise the military in Colombia in order to, fight against narco trafficking and so on. So this is extremely worrying. And an elite force of 800 compared to the 60 or 100 from withdrawal that Colin mentioned, that would be a much more serious operation to go in a surgical thing into the presidential palace and God knows what. So the Venezuelans, you can understand, are absolutely worried about this. And now let me then come to the question of the contract between Woodrow and Guaido regarding the mercenary attack. Most people have concentrated on 8 pages that were published, which is the basic of the contract. But actually, if you read the appendixes, what is involved there is the real plan the United States has for Venezuela. First, they assassinate the president and the key people in the government. Then they install Guaido as a de facto government. Then they proceed to purge society from any traces of Chavismo. They started from expelling the 20,000 Cuban doctors and others who are there helping, the Venezuelan people. And then in the contract, it says that they will purge the armed forces, which is 500,000 of them. Then they will purge the militias, which is 3.5 million of them. They will purge all the committees that have to do anything with Chavismo, which is thousands and thousands of committees. You can imagine the only way that a mercenary force of 300, even 800 can do that is by bringing in thousands and thousands of troops from either Colombia and the United States. So this is the real plan. Even though the execution of the mercenary attack on the 3rd of May was shambolic, the real plan the United States has, and it's called the extermination of Chavismo. This is what we are facing, and this is what the UK government and others are complicit with because they know this very well. Now, the Unit for Reconstruction clearly indicates, I just say very little on this because it's been covered very well. The Unit for Reconstruction, as been said already, has nothing to do with human rights, democracy, and liberty. It's got everything to do with colonial pillage. Once and if the government of Venezuela is overthrown, then the UK government has already the mechanisms and the institutions and the connections to share the spoils of, massive amount of wealth and riches and natural resources that Venezuela has. And this is where I think we have to be very sharp regarding the Europeans. How is it possible that Europeans recognize Guaido back in 2019 in January when he never stood even as a presidential candidate of anything? Fair enough, if they objected to the elections, if they didn't like the government, that's reasonable. But to recognize somebody like Guaido on those very flimsy democratic credentials, claiming articles in the Constitution which do not exist, such as things such as the interim presidency does not exist in the Venezuelan Constitution or in Venezuelan law. So the recognition of that by the European is completely unacceptable and is illegal. But worse, not only they have seen Guaido participate in attempts with the military in Colombia to push through so-called humanitarian aid with the intention of causing havoc inside Venezuela. Then they've seen Guaido taking photographs of himself with narco paramilitaries, on the Colombian side. Then they've seen Guaido on the 13th of April to, publicly try to organize a coup d'etat to overthrow the government and calling on the military to actually rise against the government. And then they've seen Guaido surrounded in, huge amount of corruption and all sorts of shenanigans. And how can still the Europeans recognize this guy when had no democratic credentials whatsoever if he ever did? So the situation is very clear. I think we need to ensure that the UK government does not participate and is not complicit in this. I would like to see as many questions raised in Parliament as possible regarding this question of an investigation to be conducted so we know exactly what is involved. I think we know enough already in order to make sure that we neutralize and stop this, and we have to do the same, and I know other countries are doing the same in Europe. So in conclusion, I'll say this. Number one, we have to demand, and this is being done in the rest of Europe, that the European Union withdraws its recognition of Guaido because it doesn't comply with any of the prerequisites, either by Venezuelan standards, international standards, or European standards, even in terms of the foreign policy principles of the European Union. There is no reason, no justification whatsoever to recognize, and given the behavior of Guaido, the criminal behavior of Guaido in the last period, and certainly deserves the recognition to be withdrawn. The second thing we want to say is that we want the Europeans to suspend the sanctions and the United States to suspend the sanctions during the period that the pandemic lasts. This is a request that's been made publicly by the United Nations General Secretary, Antonio Guterres. This is also a plea that has been made by the Pope publicly in his homily recently, but also by Josep Borrell, who has raised the point. Josep Borrell is the foreign minister of the European Union, who has raised the issue 4 times already. And already the Spanish government has facilitated resources that have been retained by banks in Spain to be given to the United Nations Development Program, so that Venezuela can actually start using those resources to buy vital health inputs and medicines and food in order to, continue saving lives. So this is what seems to me are the crucial tasks. I'll finish with this. I know we don't have a position on this, but I want to give, pay homage to George Floyd, right now. It seems to me that when he was saying, take your knee off my neck because I cannot breathe, I think it's a symbolic allegory of the situation Venezuela faces with the United States. So I'm going to say this: Trump and the US, take your knee off the neck of Venezuela. Viva Venezuela!
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco, and a very, very important point at the end and linking it together very well. Now, comrades, first of all, a plug for a petition, which I'm sure you're aware of. If you can go to it, it would be very helpful. And that's the petition at Stop Venezuela Action. You'll be able to find it. And if you need that, we can get that circulated. Now, we've got a number of other colleagues and comrades who've joined us coming in. We've got folks who've come in from Worthing, Wrexham, Kingston upon Hull, Merseyside, and I'm told that our good friend Alvaro Sanchez is on this call as well. So, Alvaro, you're very welcome, and it's good to have you with us. We've got at the moment 3 questions, and if I just put the 3 and then bring our panel in as we took them in that order, I'll try and keep the questions as tight as we can. Can we, first of all, one of the questions that's coming is, could Colombia be a base for US military intervention? Secondly, do any of the panel members have a view or think that Biden, if he is elected, will have a different policy on Venezuela? And is it possible for the panel members to talk about the human consequences of the US sanctions and the UK support for those sanctions? I'm going to start with Sue, then Colin and John and Francisco. And if we can keep it to about 3 minutes each, we may just get another round in. I know that we are scheduled for slightly later than 8 o'clock, but we need to, if we can, conclude by about 8 o'clock, give people opportunities to do whatever they've got to do. So we kick off on those points, on those questions with Sue. One on Colombia and could it be used as a military base? What are the consequences? And do you think that Biden may have a different policy, Sue? And then it will be Colin, and then John, and then Francisco.
Well, on the Colombia basis, I think it's reasonable to assume that with Colombia's attitude to Venezuela, hostile attitude towards Venezuela, that those are actually very convenient places for the US to launch an attack if they so wished. I mean, all the evidence suggests that the Colombian government is quite happy with the US approach to Venezuela. As far as Biden's policy is concerned, I don't know, but I haven't heard anything to suggest that he would depart from the long-standing US line towards Latin America. As for human consequences, well, I mean, I gave one or two examples of the consequences of sanctions, such as the blocking of imports of medicines. But I mean, the same thing applies for food. Venezuela has always required importations of food. And the US sanctions have made it very, very difficult for them to import those essential supplies.
Thanks, Sue, for answering those questions. Colin, any views on Colombia being used as a base and the consequences of action? And do you see Biden as taking a different point of view?
Okay. As regards Colombia being a base, yeah, I mean, if you follow American interventions in Latin America, ever since the Monroe Doctrine, basically they treat as their own backyard. And if you remember Correa in Ecuador, the grievous mortal sin that he committed was they actually cleared the US out of the base they had in Ecuador. So yeah, Colombia, I visited it. It's a highly militarized society. It's run by elites. It is the ideal base for really America intervening in Venezuela. I would say one thing, that the Americans are very, very guarded about sending troops into what we could call the cone of Latin America.
Yeah.
They've done it quite often in Central America and the Caribbean. It may well be a different order of things there, but I have no illusions as regards Colombia. On the thing about Biden, the real defeat for the left was the defeat of Bernie Sanders, which had really massive repercussions. I follow the American political scene fairly closely, and I've noticed the leader of the Democrats, Pelosi, sucking up to Guaido, presenting as some kind of saint. And if you really follow Biden's historical trajectory politically, and Pelosi and the mainstream Democrats, the Clintonites, etc., I'm afraid if we're thinking for 1 minute that things will be better under Biden in Latin America, I think we're sadly mistaken. Perversely, the more right-wing the American administration is, the better it is for building alliances and mobilizing people in Latin America. I know that's off the kind of scale in some respects, but no to any succor or relief from Biden, in my opinion.
Thanks, Colin. John?
Yeah, so if there is any attempt, well, as there already has been an incursion, it will likely come from Colombia. Colombia has been the US's chief, if not one of the US's chief allies in the region since the end of the Second World War. Colombia was the only Latin American nation to send troops to the Korean War. Since the 1960s, the US has been plowing counterinsurgency assistance into Colombia, into its armed forces. Most of Colombia's armed forces have been trained in some way, shape or form by the US. Colombia presently has 9 separate US bases situated there. You saw operations launched from Colombia on the 23rd of February 2019 when the US tried to force supposedly humanitarian aid trucks into the country in an attempt to cause total chaos. Aside from that, and this is where Biden gets linked in as well, so I'm going to link the two answers. Back in the late 1990s, Joe Biden was one of the chief architects of Plan Colombia. So Plan Colombia was supposedly an attempt to resolve Colombia's civil war, which was between the FARC paramilitary groups and the Colombian state. However, what Plan Colombia actually ended up was, rather than being a kind of social welfare program and a way to help cocoa farmers transition from cocoa farming to separate means of earning money, ended up in one of the biggest packages of US military assistance in the past 3 decades. I think it was the third biggest for the past 20 years of when it occurred, when it was finally signed in 2000. And so Joe Biden was one of the chief architects of this. In the years that followed that in Colombia, Colombia was probably, in the UN's word, in Jan Egeland of the UN, the worst abuser of human rights in the Western Hemisphere. Colombia consistently compiled more trade unionist murders than the rest of the world combined. So whether Joe Biden is going to be a positive force for this region, the answer is categorically no. But just to mention Sanders as well, I mean, Sanders hasn't been particularly helpful on the issue of Venezuela neither, although he was the best hope for the left at the time. He actually called Maduro a brutal tyrant, and he consistently kind of crumbled to pressure within the DNC to delegitimize the Maduro government. So yeah, what we've got is a typical case of bipartisan imperialism in the US. And whether Biden or Trump get in, I don't think either of the resolutions are going to be good for Venezuela.
Thanks, John. Francisco, do you want to answer those three points? We've got some of a question coming in, but over to you.
On the question of Colombia, I mean, everything has been said, and if there's going to be any war against Venezuela, Colombia will be the base from which will be launched. There are 2 other dimensions that regarding this issue of Colombia and a possible US attack against Venezuela that must be mentioned. Number one, what was obvious from the Mercenary attack, and it's become very evident, is the participation, active participation and collusion between security forces, intelligence forces, the military, and narco-traffickers. In fact, the mercenaries trained in camps that were the property of a very famous Doble Rueda, very famous narco-trafficker, who is supposed to be in jail, but is free, this, acting and financing the whole thing. And the Venezuelan government is absolutely justified in suggesting that given that the operation took place in a particular area in La Guajira, where about 200, 300 meters away, there is a very big center of the DEA. And during the night, the Americans have been arrested, the mercenaries, revealed publicly that actually throughout the night, the number of trucks and activity that was going on, mobilizing God knows what, definitely cocaine, was taking place without any impediment whatsoever. So the DEA seems to be a central part of any operation of this kind in alliance with the narco-traffickers. That means, possibly connections with the political apparatus in Colombia itself. So it's quite an important thing. And the reason why this is important from the point of view of the narco-traffickers is because they want to open a route through Venezuela, which is difficult because Venezuela stops it. 70 to 80 to 85% of the cocaine actually the rest of the United States does it through the Pacific. And they need to actually get there. And the reason why they need to get there is because in the last 3-4 years, the amount of cocaine production has increased by more than 40%. This is information, official information from the DEA itself. So you have 9 military bases there to fight against narco trafficking. You have a huge US military presence, yet cocaine continues to grow. And from the point of view of the narco traffickers, it's vital that they open that route. On Biden, I won't say much, except that he committed himself to reverse Cuba policy. That's the only thing he said. On everything else, I totally agree with everybody else, except that between now and November, he's likely to find a country, if he becomes the president, which is going to be much diminished. And with the movement in the streets, they are not going to be sympathetic to any idea of going for a war of any kind whatsoever, because they would like the money to be used for public services, you know, looking after the people and so on. We'll see how that works out. Regarding the question of the, you know, human consequences of the sanctions, which are disgusting. If you look at them very carefully, it's about 350 of them. And they are targeting 32 million Venezuelans. That's the purpose of it. You know, to try to stop food, medicine, and every other vital input is a crime against humanity. There is no question about it. So therefore, the government of Venezuela has taken the individual responsible for this in the US government to the International Criminal Court, who the government has accused of being criminals against, you know, committing crimes against humanity. And for as long as the sanction continues, the crime against humanity is continued to be perpetrated. So it's extremely important. And given that the Venezuelan diplomacy is very skillful, they seem to have a sympathetic ear in the United Nations. They certainly had an non-aligned movement behind them. Certainly China, Russia, and others support such an appeal. So the United States seems to be in difficulties. We'll see how this goes. So not only we have to denounce what the United States are doing, but it would be important to explain to everybody these charges against the United States for crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court, because we have to support it, because we have to stop it.
Thanks very much, Francisco. We've got another question that's come in, and it's actually in two parts, as they used to say. With the arguments that justified the Bolivia coup beginning to fall apart, how can we in the UK raise the case of Bolivia as an example of what regime change in Venezuela is all about? And are there any other historical parallels, such as has been mentioned, the coup in Chile and the intervention in Panama? I know that this is one of these complicated ones, but I think we'd probably just be able to do a couple of minutes each around on that, and then I can wrap up. But thanks to everybody who's written in, and those are very complex questions, which I suppose we can have a whole seminar on. But Sue, do you want to kick off on those two particular points?
Well, the Bolivia coup, there has been quite a strong campaign against the Bolivia coup. And I would recommend that people have a look at the website, have a look at Labour Friends of Progressive Latin America, and also Friends of, what's it called, Friends of Bolivia, to check out all the lessons that can be learned from that. What was the second one?
Well, the second one was parallels between other coups, and I know we'd already mentioned Chile and intervention in Panama. Well, you probably know a little bit more about the situation in Panama. Somebody does than I do.
Well, I don't, but there are certainly huge parallels in Chile. And in fact, you can look on the internet, and the CIA actually carried out their own investigation into their activities in Chile. And you can see the report where they spell out a lot of the things that I mentioned in my introductions of, the same strategies that they later used in Venezuela of funding opposition groups, having propaganda campaigns, working with NGOs, student activists, targeting women's groups. You've seen the same kind of things happen in Nicaragua as well. Sort of similar method of operating to try to destabilize the government. I think it's been used in a lot of areas. Thanks,
Sue. Colin, could you probably enlighten us about Panama, but do you want to pick up a couple of those points?
Yeah. As regards Panama, I remember the American intervention to overthrow Noriega. The parallels are a bit difficult, a bit hard to make, because never forget, Noriega essentially was the tool of the Americans for a long period, and then fell out with them. So they waged a campaign, a short, vicious campaign to overthrow him. The important point is this, that I think it's a fair one, that Noriega didn't have a mass support, historical support behind him. So the intervention in Panama was really kind of a small scale intervention compared to the scale of anything that would be needed to overthrow Maduro. Francisco mentioned earlier that the Venezuelan army is over 1 million strong, that 3.3 citizens are in arms. And I remember Chavez once saying that we are a country in arms, the people are in arms. And what any intervention in Venezuela would mean, it would be the most bloody intervention we've seen probably anywhere in the world. Because wherever interventions have been taking place in the past, they've not come up against the kind of scale of the Venezuelan armed forces and the people mobilized. And what that means is, and Francisco spelt it out in great detail about the plans they have for overthrowing Venezuela, is a root and branch rooting out of left democratic forces on a scale we've never, ever seen before. It will truly be a massive fascist intervention. And I use the word fascist, you know, in a hopefully a scientific way, not just running off at the mouth. So I think, yeah, and never forget, by the way, that the current mobilization of the US Navy in the waters around Venezuela are the biggest mobilization of the US Navy since the intervention in Panama. So it is a bit eerie when you look at those kind of things. But if that's been helpful to, you know, advance the discussion, I'll just throw that one in. Okay.
Thanks very much, Colin. I think that analysis there with the situation against Noriega is very important. It's a different situation, and you're right to point out that a boots on the ground battle in Venezuela will be entirely different than anything the US has encountered before. John, do you want to pick up on any of those points?
Yeah, I'll go for the first one first. Yeah, as Colin said, I was recently speaking to one of the few Anglophone journalists currently in Bolivia, and who's been there for many months now during the coup process, Ali Vargas. One of his main points is that the Bolivian government under Morales didn't successfully capture the institutions of the state, like the military and the police, that were later essential in the coup process. In terms of calling it what it is at the time as well, I mean, in the month after the coup in Bolivia, it started to become clear that the OAS's designation of the electoral process as fraudulent was not scientific, was not correct, was not factual. However, all of the corporate media, The Guardian, The Economist, the Financial Times, The Times, etc., were totally blind to this information. They totally refused to acknowledge this evidence when it was actually important. Now, yesterday, I assume you saw the New York Times article based on a recent academic study that said the OAS's statistical analysis of the voting records in Bolivia was flawed. Now, it's 8 months after the coup now. We're 8 months into a military regime or a military-backed regime in Bolivia. Now, it's virtually impotent 8 months later to suddenly look at the evidence again across the corporate media and say, oh, well, now we can see the truth. It's too late. But just to briefly talk about parallels, one of the main parallels I found, because I spent 3 weeks in Venezuela across March and April in 2019, briefly after the first coup attempt. And what I observed, it was quite similar to Nicaragua during the 1980s. It's kind of like a slow, enduring process of economic sanctions and various violent support for violent incursions and violent operations within the country, similar to the Contras. But also the kind of social and economic success story that Venezuela told, especially during the years of Hugo Chavez. It was very similar to Nicaragua, which was totally ignored throughout the entire Western media. Mark Curtis, the historian Mark Curtis, did an analysis of the Sandinistas in the UK press. He found that in over 500 articles across the Daily Telegraph, the Times and Financial Times, none of them mentioned the social and economic success story that Nicaragua was in many different ways during that process. To take the BBC in Venezuela, over 343 different articles published during 1998 to 2008, only 3 of them mentioned the social and economic success stories under Hugo Chavez, which, as we all know, were very significant. And another final parallel between the two is Elliot Abrams, who was in charge of various different regime change efforts in Nicaragua during the time. As we know, he was convicted for using humanitarian aid, for using Red Cross airplanes to ship in weapons to the Contras at the time. And now we've got Elliot Abrams using humanitarian aid trucks to try and get into Venezuela in February 2019. So I would say that there's a lot of parallels with Nicaragua.
Thanks, John. And now finally, Francisco, again, any parallels you can draw on that, and also the situation in Bolivia?
Yeah, there's absolutely no legal or any other justification for the de facto government. Most things have been said about this already. But what matters to me in terms of giving a broader picture of it is the fact that the de facto government is a racist, intensely racist government that enjoys brutalizing indigenous people. And the target of the thugs in the streets are usually indigenous women who happen to be going to the market or walking around the place, and they're attacked. And the government is organizing military forces and police forces to attack strongholds of indigenous communities that are bastions of the Evo Morales support. And this is extremely worrying because they have perpetrated already 2 massacres where the army and the police have used brutal force and live ammunition and assassinated, on one occasion, more than 40 people. So this is what we're talking about. And the pandemic has complicated everything, but what the government are doing, they're just giving away just about anything that's been obtained in that country that has an extraordinary economic record of 5% economic growth per year on average for the last 10 years. Poverty has been reduced, and now everything is being reversed. The population are brutalized. They're trying to illegalize people who they think differently, such as the MAS, the political party of Evo Morales. They're doing everything possible to justify using lawfare and the judges and so on, and they're persecuted. They have several comrades, trade union leaders, politicians and others in prison where they're not treated well. And the movement is extremely careful to deal with this because they know that the consequence will be dire. And it's a corrupt government like hell. The Minister of Health was discovered a few days ago, was arrested by the very same de facto government because he bought ventilation machines to deal with the pandemic. He charged the government $27,000 for each, and he bought them at $7,000. And this was discovered. Now he's in prison. And the levels of corruption are completely rampant now. And the movement is fighting to make sure that there are elections as soon as possible. And this is the struggle that the Bolivian people, the masses, the peasants, the working class, and the mass political party. And already they managed to get the National Electoral Council to agree to a date, which is the 6th of September. And they're warning towards these days. The government, the de facto government, the de facto racist government are going to try to use any excuse to postpone it. And they're trying to use the pandemic to try to postpone it. We'll see how it goes. So this is where we might come in, in solidarity to help them. Regarding the parallels with Panama, there are 2 important parallels that haven't been mentioned. I agree with all of the others. Number 1, William Barr, who was Secretary of Justice at the time in 1989, when the invasion of Panama took place on the 20th of December 1989, he accused the government of being a narco-terrorist state. And William Barr happens to be the Secretary of Justice now, and he has actually accused, formally, passes that resolution, accused the Venezuelan government of being a narco-terrorist state. What it means is this, that with the executive order of Obama, which has been renewed every single year up to now, where Venezuela is declared an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, therefore the United States is in a state of emergency, it means legally and technically the United States is in a state of war with Venezuela. And now that Venezuela is added this additional charge as being a narco-terrorist state, then the United States has all the legal reasons to go to war against Venezuela, and this is important. That's number one. Number two, regarding the, the actual context, how easy it would be for them. The Panamanian Defense Forces at the time, in 1999, were 20,000 in total. In about 3 days, the United States was able to fly in 27,000 GIs. And with 27,000, in the context of the isolation and the lack of popularity of Manuel Noriega, was a very easy thing to do. I think with Venezuela, it's a much more difficult, certainly a total order. The Venezuelans say all the time, it will be easy for them to get in. It will be very difficult for them to leave. And one thing is important, they say, sometimes they say, very strongly, they said, if they're coming in prepared to kill, they should be prepared to die. And we do not want war, we want peace, but we are going to defend, and they say this with tears in their eyes, we are going to defend our nation with our lives if necessary. And for the United States, it will be a very difficult thing to chew. I think there are two wings within the State Department, within particularly the Pentagon. They're saying, should we not? And the problem they have is this, and I leave you with this, point of reflection. Damn if they do, damn if they don't. We'll see what happens. All we can do is to make sure that we create the massive solidarity movement so that we stop it, and certainly stop their accomplices here in the UK.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. And to everybody who's been on this call through Zoom and through YouTube, thank you for taking part and also for sending in those questions. I'm going to close the meeting now, but before I do, I always give a plug to our social media. And it's important that if you're not already following the VSC campaign on Twitter, you can do that. It's easy to find. You just go in the search box and you'll find us there. But we're also got a very active Facebook page. And of course, we also have our website, and there are articles that do appear on the website, and those that go in other newspapers, we're more than happy to tweet them. Also, again, a good plug for Labour Friends of Latin America, and Colin has done a fantastic amount of work there. And obviously the work that we do, as I say, through our website. If any of you comrades are on these calls are members of trade unions, and I hope that you are, if your union or your branch or your district or your region isn't affiliated to Venezuela Solidarity, it's easy to do. You should join us and give us that support. So can I thank everybody for their contributions tonight, to Sue, Colin, John and Francisco, and Ben and Matt, who've been working the gizmos at the back and keeping YouTube linked up as well. We've finished just about on time, so thank you very much, and hopefully stay safe, and then we'll be hopefully see you physically, not virtually, at some point when we have our AGM and all the other work that we do later this year. Thanks very much for your time, and wish you a safe evening.